Hello and welcome to my channel In Search of Wonder. My name is Anne and this is my three-part series on the male characters in Jane Austen's stories. In my previous video, we talked about Mr. Darcy and Mr. Bingley and Edward Ferrars, and then in today's video, we're going to get into the characters from three other of Jane Austen's novels, including Northanger Abbey and Persuasion and Mansfield Park. So sit back and enjoy my thoughts on these characters. Originally, this video was not intended to be a series. When I filmed it, it was one really overly longish video. So I'm breaking it into chunks, so hopefully that clears up any confusion that happens in the process of watching it. So let's go. So in Mansfield Park, everybody loves to hate on Edmund. And I have heard many people say that they wish Fanny had ended up with Henry Crawford, which I don't know. I just, sometimes people say things, I gotta be honest. Okay, this is just my honest opinion, okay? Sometimes I listen to people talk about characters in books and I wanna ask them, like, have you ever met anybody? Like, do you know any actual people? Because the way you're talking about these characters in these books makes it sound like you've never met anybody or you've never interacted with other people, other humans, and that you have no idea how humans carry on in the real world. And you have zero understanding of human interaction and relationships, despite the fact that you've read a lot of books. But that's what I think sometimes when I hear people talk. And one of those times is when people say that Fanny should have ended up with Henry Crawford. And I just, like, Henry Crawford is legit a bad guy. Like, he's not good. He's not faithful to anybody in the story, in the whole course of the story. Not a single person. And just because he falls in love with Fanny, and by the way, I don't think that he actually falls in love with Fanny. He falls in love with an idealized Fanny in his mind. And I think that Austen is pretty clear about that. Because he sees Fanny as this kind of like angelic creature, and he almost idolizes her and puts her on a pedestal during the time frame in which he is in love with her. And the minute she is out of his sight, he has forgotten her and he's moved on and he's committing adultery with a married woman. So Henry is not a good person. Why do we want Fanny to marry Henry? What do you have against Fanny that you want to put her together with Henry? And people think, well, Henry, like, he has some good qualities. He could have been a good guy. Coulda, woulda, shoulda. Wasn't. Definitely was not a good guy. And he had an opportunity to make a choice, and he made the wrong one. Fanny would have been miserable married to Henry. Miserable, okay? There's no denying. Let's talk about Edmund. People think that Edmund is, I don't know, I've heard him described in many ways, like a stick in the mud, or self-righteous, or boring, or all of these things. And also, a lot of people get really ticked off by the fact that Edmund never sees Fanny, or so they say. Again, that's one of the things that I like, okay, did you read the book? Like, anyway. He is distracted by Mary Crawford, yes. He lacks awareness of the character of Mary Crawford, yes. Those are his flaws. Those are his flaws. Is he like a bit of a boring personality? Yes, maybe. I think he's quiet, but he's caring. He really cares about Fanny. If you read the story with this lens in mind, look at all of the interactions between Edmund and Fanny, and then compare Edmund's interactions with Fanny with everybody else in that family and how they relate to Fanny and how they use her and abuse her. Edmund is the only one who sees Fanny as a person in her own right and treats her as such. and stands up for her to his relatives. When Edmund's father comes back from being overseas and he begins to see Fanny, he begins to see the value of her as well. Like, he sees the value in her character because he's kind of been confronted by his own children and their deficiencies in character. And he sees Fanny and how much of a better person she is. And he develops a lot of respect for her. So he begins to have respect for Fanny along the same lines as Edmund does. He appreciates her. And his wife always has appreciated Fanny, but only for what Fanny can do for her, because Fanny is always, helping her and is always serving her kindly and selflessly. And so she laps it up and she lets Fanny serve her endlessly, even though Fanny is not a servant. And she's kind to her as far as that goes, but she's not very loving towards her, if that makes sense. Edmund is the only one who actually sees Fanny as a person, as an individual. He cares about her. Fanny is one of Austen's female characters that is not very strong. In fact, she's kind of weak and prone to be ill. And Edmund knows this and he cares about that. And he makes sure that she doesn't do too much or isn't overworked. And he gets very upset when his family overworks Fanny. And he's very protective of her. And so for all of those reasons, I think those things outweigh the flaws in Edmund in the balance. And I think that he's a perfect fit for Fanny. I think the two of them go very well together. Now, let's talk about Edmund's flaws. His primary flaw, aside from the fact that maybe he's a little boring, okay, I get that. I think he's perfect for Fanny. I don't think that she, a dashing person like Henry who mixes in society and is flamboyant, isn't the right person for her, because she's too retiring for that. She doesn't want to be in that mix. And so I think Edmund is perfect for her. So those two go very well together. So I don't see it as a flaw. Maybe for, myself, maybe, I don't know. I don't really care if a person is, if a person is boring, to the outside world, and doesn't seem to have, a brilliant, strong personality, I can still be good friends with them. And I could still maybe, fall in love with them if they were a guy. To me, whatever, that's fine. But I guess he doesn't make a very dashing hero of a story, so I can understand that. I can understand that in a literary way, why he wouldn't be the favorite, right? But I think he's perfect for Fanny, and I think they go very well together. So his flaw can be boiled down to this. His flaw is that he is distracted by Mary Crawford, and it takes a lot for him to admit the flaws in her character. The flaws in her character that are such that make her the absolute wrong person for him, because she's a terrible person. And so falling in love with such a terrible person is kind of a mark against Edmund, right? So that is a flaw in Edmund, for sure, 100%. But through the course of the story, he overcomes that. There is a point where he can't excuse away or look past Mary Crawford's behavior anymore, because it's so blatant and it's so obvious. He can't ignore it. He can't look past it. He can't excuse it. He can't forgive it, not in the sense of enabling him to pursue a relationship anymore with her. He knows that her character is fixed and it's terrible. And so he doesn't want anything to do with that. And so he breaks off the relationship with her. So there is a point where he overcomes that flaw and he realizes that Mary is a terrible person. And his other flaw is that because he's distracted by Mary, he doesn't see Fanny as a person whom he could fall in love with and get married. In fact, he doesn't realize that he has actually, in fact, fallen in love with her already. And it takes a while for him to realize that. So that's a flaw. But again, he overcomes that. And the unfortunate thing is, and I'll talk about this in a minute, is that we don't really get to see that aspect of his development. We don't get to see him suddenly seeing Fanny for the first time. We don't get to participate too much in that, because it kind of happens very rapidly at the end. It's kind of rushed through, and we don't really get to spend time with that development. So it might seem a little bit rushed. So there's a definite issue there with that, the way that story gets wrapped up. So I think that also contributes a lot to people thinking that Edmund is not a good fit for Fanny. So that's Mansfield Park. Let's talk about Northanger Abbey. So we have Henry Tilney in Northanger Abbey. And Henry Tilney is overall a lovable guy, right? Like he's easygoing, he's outgoing, he's friendly, he's cheerful, he's refined. He has enough money. He's a second son, but he has enough. He can support a family. He's, not going to be living in poverty, right? So he is a suitable groom for Catherine Morland in this story. And he doesn't have a lot of rough edges, right? He's just a friendly, fun guy. But one thing that people dislike about this particular relationship is that there does seem to be a bit of an imbalance because Catherine is so young, and so she's very naive, and she's very gullible, and she is not wise in the ways of the world. And Henry is none of those things. Henry Tilney is none of those things. And so he serves in the story as kind of her guide into the ways of the world and into greater maturity and into greater insight. He teaches her many things. They have many conversations that are enlightening to her and that help her to mature and grow as a person. And a lot of people understandably see this as a flaw in the relationship, that it's not ideal for a romantic relationship or for establishing a husband and wife relationship, because it kind of puts him on a level a little bit higher than Catherine and makes it so that she is constantly a little bit below him in terms of wisdom and insight and perception. So that's definitely true. There is an element of that I would agree with. I love the ending of the story, and I love how they get together, and it is very romantic. I actually really like that part and how he comes to her family and sees her family. And I think it wouldn't have happened the way it was if Catherine wasn't so young and like a little bit awkward about everything, and that made it really sweet overall. But it does contribute to a little bit of imbalance in that relationship. So I can appreciate that perspective, but I don't think that it is terrible in their situation. I think that Henry is a good enough person that he will never lord over Catherine, which could be the end result of a relationship like that. Like, he's not like his father, who's autocratic and mean. He's not like that. He's a kind person, and he is a loving person. And so even though he has more insight and wisdom than Catherine does, I think she has enough humility to recognize that, and she's willing to learn from him. And I think also that as she grows and matures, she will even out with him and equal up to where he is. I think that we see her in this story in a very young and naive point, and we don't see the full development. We just see the part of it. But I think that we can assume that she will continue to develop in that way, and that as she spends more time with Henry and his family and in the world at large and with life experience, that she will not always be like foolish. She's not a foolish person. She's capable of learning. She's capable of growing. And so I think that in a sense, she'll catch up to Henry. So that doesn't bother me, again, too much in that story. I can see why people say that about them and their relationship, but I think in the end, they're going to be fine. Okay. I don't see any red flags for those two people in particular. Other scenarios and situations with real life people, I would caution, because you could end up with a Mr. and Mrs. Bennet sort of situation where, the wife is foolish and is never going to be anything but foolish. And so it becomes a drain on the marriage relationship. Like, that could be problematic. We don't want that happening. But I don't see that happening with Henry and Catherine Morland. But, if someone has a caution about that, I think that there's wisdom there, right? Let's talk about persuasion. And let's talk about Captain Wentworth. A lot of people don't like how Captain Wentworth treats Anne when he comes back. Because, okay, spoiler alert, I can't explain why he's a problem unless I explain the plot, okay? So, spoiler alert. Head on to the Emma section if you don't want to hear this, okay? So, Captain Wentworth and Anne are briefly engaged when they are young. Her family puts a stop to, or pressures her, I should say, to put a stop to the engagement. And so she does, she breaks it off. Captain Wentworth goes off brokenhearted and serves as a captain on a ship and comes back fabulously wealthy from his prize money. and is ready to marry. He happens to come to the very town where Anne lives. Her situations have changed. She's come down in the world a little bit, one or two rungs. You know, her family has been humbled. And they are thrown together in a variety of scenarios. But in front of her, he flirts rather outrageously with two young ladies. Anne, by this time, is in her mid to late 20s, has lost her bloom of youth, and the cares of life have kind of worn her down a little bit, and he's going after these basically hot young things in front of her. And he is not very kind to her in the process. In fact, he seems to demonstrate a fairly resentful attitude towards her. And a lot of people also complain that there's not enough development in this story where we see his heart changing. Anne's heart has never changed, and his hasn't really either, but it's been clouded by resentment and anger towards her. In the end, they end up together, but a lot of people complain about that because they feel like Captain Wentworth kind of just gets a pass for being angry and resentful towards Anne. But I do think that it's important to have a little bit of a broader compassion for Captain Wentworth, because I think it's important to step back and look at the scenario and think about this for a second, okay? And put yourself in his shoes. So they were happy and they were in love and they got engaged, and Anne was happy to marry him and he wanted to marry her. But then she comes back to him and says, I'm sorry, I can't marry you because my family doesn't want me to because you're not rich enough. I mean, it's not a very kind thing to do. Like, Anne isn't completely perfect in this scenario, right? Like, she bows to the pressure. She is persuaded by her family to give up this man that she loves. She puts her family above him. And so that generates resentment on his part. And when he comes back, just seeing her brings up all of that resentment in his heart again. And there may even be some of, I mean, look where you are in the world now. You can't even live in your family estate anymore because your family doesn't have enough money to live there anymore. And yet you gave me up 7 years ago or however many years it was. And look where you are now. I mean, I think it's not ideal human nature, but I think it's normal. And I think it's more accurate human nature for Captain Wentworth than for him to come back and all of a sudden be falling over her feet and pursuing her rather than these other, young ladies. On top of which, these other girls, like, they basically throw themselves at Captain Wentworth in a kind of ridiculous fashion and very immature. If anything, that bothers me more. Like, it's like, okay, dude, you are too old for these teeny boppers. Like, no, it's just not a good fit. And you should know that. Like, they're stupid young girls, and you should know that. You should know that. But I think part of it was, probably deep down inside he knew that, but I think he wanted to hurt Anne back a little bit for how she hurt him. And again, that's a flaw. In the end, they have a conversation, he writes the letter about it, and where he kind of explains the how his feelings, how he has been affected by their situation over the past 7 years. And so they work everything out, and in the end, they still are together and they get married, etc. And her family still has objections, but she's finally gets to a point where she's like, okay, whatever, I'm going to marry Captain Wentworth. And he is wealthy enough at this point that is not something, and also because, their situation has changed, it's not something that they can use against her, right? He doesn't have status, but he does have plenty of money to support her, so they're not in a position to really push back too much on that score. So that wraps up my discussion on those heroes of Austen stories. If you have any thoughts to add to mine, please share them in the comments. I am very curious about your thoughts and what you think about these particular gentlemen as described by Austen. And stay tuned for part 3 of this series, where I will wrap up with a discussion of Mr. Knightley and Emma, and then talk just generally my thoughts about how Austen wrote her male characters and the strengths and weaknesses in the ways that she portrayed them and wrote about them, according to me. And so that one should be coming live in a few days, hopefully. So when it is available, please be sure to watch part 3 of this series, where I wrap up this discussion on Austen and her male characters.